welcome everyone to another special edition of The American Mind. I'm your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute and publisher of the Claremont Review of Books and The American Mind. On today's special episode, I interview Christopher Rufo, known to many of you, I'm sure, the author of a new book, America's Cultural Revolution, How the Radical Left Conquered Everything. At the Claremont Institute, we first got to know Chris back when he did a Lincoln Fellowship, maybe 7-8 years ago now or so. He was impressive then, a documentarian, and was looking for a change in careers. Journalism and activism was in his sights, and he has certainly made good on that plan to change careers. He's had great success in recent years in bringing to the attention of the American people and elites across the country the problem of a racialized politics and educational system, whether it be in the form of critical race theory or the trans revolution or anything else. We talk about his book, but we also talk about the wider political and commentary landscape, what conservative philanthropists should be working on, how aspiring young journalists might shape their careers, and what advice Chris has for them. So we range across the field, and we think you'll enjoy this episode quite a bit. Thanks for listening. Well, welcome, Chris. Very happy to have you here on the occasion of the publication of your new book, America's Cultural Revolution. As I said, before we started recording, we don't need to walk through the book. You've done tons of press on the book. I encourage people to check it out, check out the many reviews, the praise for it. I'm going to use it as the occasion to just get your thoughts on the current political scene. First, I want to set up for our listeners the sort of Claremont history of America. It's a bit potted just because we're going to run through it quickly. I know you got a taste of this back when you did a Lincoln Fellowship with us years ago. And I just want you to situate your argument in your book within this framework, and then we can go from there. So, I mean, our take on American history is that the American founding, especially the principles of the Declaration, was a great and good and noble thing. The Constitution, in many ways, was novel and a novel innovation of political science with the separation of powers and all that. Slavery, of course, was a problem to be fixed later. Things were going pretty well. Nobody's perfect. You have fits and starts of problems in American history. But the real first sustained critique of constitutionalism and the American order and natural rights and all that comes in the form of progressivism. And you get the beginnings of, at the turn of the 20th century, the beginnings of this critique, which accompanied by a new way of doing government. That is, the separation of powers needs to be overcome. A bureaucracy needs to be formed. If we can only get experts doing scientific social science, applying the newest innovations of social science to American society without the interference of politicians, we can finally have heaven on earth. Now, the early form of this is sort of Woodrow Wilson and his critique. FDR, of course, perfects the political application of it. LBJ comes along and we get the beginnings of sort of cultural leftism and really the explosion only with LBJ and the Great Society of the real bureaucracy as we know it today. I mean, it was a little bit of it was there in the FTC and other organizations during FDR's tenure and after, but it really just explodes in the 60s and 70s. How would you fit this book and your argument in that run of American institutional history?
Yeah, I mean, it is essentially the inner history told through the vehicles of left-wing activism and intellectual life of the 1968 to the present. So that last phase. And so, of course, I agree with the broad strokes of the kind of Claremont reading of American history. And then my particular interest in this book was to show when you have the institutional apparatus set in the mid-1960s, you have the bureaucracy that has built up for a half century, accelerating through FDR and then exploding with LBJ. What I was particularly interested in is taking that as my background, taking that as the status quo, was how did radical left-wing ideologies infiltrate those systems, seek power within those bureaucracies, and then use them not to pursue, even according to the more kind of modernist progressive vision, the common good, but to use them as ideological weapons and turning them self-consciously against the American citizens and using extra parliamentary tactics to take power. So it is kind of I guess the story of the war within both the kind of the left more broadly, but also the war of control for that bureaucratic structure, and moving that bureaucratic structure away from, in theory, a kind of neutral, expert-led administration of goods and services oriented towards commonly held values and principles, but actually subverting that and using it as an instrument of raw ideological power. And so I think that the book is a kind of nice piece at the top of the Claremont canon to show what it looks like in practice, in great historical detail, when those bureaucracies, I would say, reveal their true nature, and are in a sense the greatest threat to the constitutional system itself.
Yeah. And I just encourage everyone to pick the book up if they haven't. It's a series of, among other things, kind of portraits of some of the main intellectual players, whether it's Herbert Marcuse or Angela Davis, from the Frankfurt School to Black Power and the warping of our educational institutions. So I encourage everyone to pick it up. Do you have I know you're, well, I'll start here. I think a lot of our listeners, I know you've done tons of press on this book, but they still would like to know, you kind of came out of nowhere on the political journalistic scene on this issue, and you've been very, very effective. I think people have rightly called you the most effective journalist and activist on this issue of critical race theory and diversity, equity, inclusion, from Ron DeSantis to Barry Weiss, kind of across the post-liberal center and on the right, and those are all deserved praises from those folks. But how did you come to this issue when you came to do a Lincoln Fellowship with us? I forget when it was, maybe 7-8 years ago at least. You were a documentary filmmaker. How'd you come to be where you are today?
Yeah, I think it's been a few years, and so I was a documentary filmmaker for many years, as you just described, and I always loved politics, and really for me it was a kind of a return into politics, and so I used some of my documentary skills. I connected with first the great people at Discovery Institute in Seattle, and then with you and the rest of the Claremont team to try to see what it might be like to get more involved in intellectual life and media and policy and all of these kind of various facets of American politics, and found that my skills as a documentary filmmaker were most directly translatable to doing some writing projects. So I started doing a lot of on-the-ground reporting in West Coast cities, looking at homelessness, drug addiction, mental illness, crime, chaos and destruction. Built up a body of work on those set of issues, but ultimately concluded that there weren't, many victories to be had given the kind of political nature of America's kind of largest left-wing West Coast cities. And I started actually on critical race theory, though, coming out of that, in a sense by chance. It was a tip that I had received about what was happening inside the city of Seattle. It was the kind of white privilege training and internalized whiteness training, racially segregating employees and rewarding and punishing them based on their ancestry. The whole 9 yards, what we now think of as critical race theory and DEI. And that story, at first, I reported it for City Journal as a one-off. Oh, this is kind of a curiosity from life in Seattle, but it quickly snowballed. I started getting stories from everywhere, and as I was doing all of this reporting, and started in Seattle, then it was schools, and then it was the federal government. It really ballooned into this national issue, and I think a lot of politics is timing. And so, you had in that spring and summer the George Floyd riots. BLM was triumphant. And I started doing that reporting in July, August, September of that year. So really right on the heels of the BLM surge. And I think that it gave the political right, and it gave, the kind of right-leaning media a vehicle of criticism that was oblique. It wasn't directly attacking, BLM as such, but I think it was successful because it was actually attacking below the surface of BLM and related movements by exposing the ideology. And so that was really fun. That's really what kicked this all off. And it was a absolutely wild ride of reporting and media combat and, fending off attacks and engaging in attacks of my own. And through that experience, I learned so much, not just about the subject matter, but so much about how politics actually works, how power works, legislation works, how leadership works. I had a front row seat into some pretty incredible fights.
Yeah, it's been fun to watch. And you, in the very beginning of the book, you recount some of this, and then also in some way you were already doing work and doing media, of course, but you calling on President Trump to ban critical race theory through executive order and federal institutions was on Tucker was was pretty great, and hilariously, as you've recounted elsewhere, you got a call the next morning from the chief of staff saying Trump wanted it done. So Trump's presidency was one of those rare moments where, if you just got on the right Fox show and came up with a good policy and pushed it eloquently, it had a pretty good chance of making its way through the executive branch like that week. It's remarkable.
Yeah, it is. It is, and love him or hate him. I mean, Trump. It was such a unique presence and a unique president. And one thing that I really admired working on this critical race theory policy is that, he saw it on Fox. He instructed his chief of staff to call me the next morning. And he said, let's get this done. Let's figure it out. And I remember afterwards, I talked with some of the staffers and they said, typically an executive order takes 6 months, maybe more. It has to go through all of these approvals. It gets gutted at DOJ. It goes through the White House staff. It gets on the president's desk. And Trump got it done in something like 3 weeks. It was just he wanted it done. He wanted it done now, and I think that is something that I really admired, and I think it also shows how politics changed. It's not that you had to have a white paper and a think tank stamp on it, and it goes through the process, and there are lobbyists. There was a kind of ferment and an openness, and maybe even a bit of desperation, because the administration was not functioning, was really resisting the president in so many ways that I think he rightly decided, I have to do things just from the top and get them done in whatever way possible, and bypassing some of the bureaucracy that would seek to undermine it. So I think there's a lot of lessons there too for whoever might be, the next Republican president of, positive and negative lessons.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned executive orders taking 6 months. For those not familiar with how White Houses work and now the federal cabinets work, normally you send this through the quote unquote interagency process, which is where good ideas go to get watered down and die. And Trump was able to short circuit that. I mean, I guess I'm not telling you anything you don't know. The one unfortunate aspect of that is that, of course, the Biden administration reversed it on day one because it was a mere executive order. So have you talked to federal lawmakers much about what to do policy-wise on this topic that you have been so effective in advocating for?
I have. I had a chance to do some congressional breakfasts and talk with, folks in Congress. I'm going to be in D.C. Just like 2 weeks, speaking to Jim Banks and the anti-woke caucus. They've organized on these issues, an actual congressional caucus.
Right.
And, I'll tell you what, I've even spoken with, I'll say, to keep it kind of vague, I've spoken, at least one Democratic member of Congress on these issues, and so I think that there is a widespread dissatisfaction and even a widespread kind of moving back from some of these woke policies, not just among Republicans, but even among moderate Democrats who see 2020 rightly as something of a disaster, especially those politicians who are around the big cities. They can see every day when they go back home to their big districts, to their local districts rather. They can see what these policies mean for people, and for those Democrats who are still committed to, basic social insurance, fair play, quality infrastructure, securing people's basic right to safety, the actual building blocks of good government, those kind of Democrats are very wary of their very left flank, and I think are looking for a way to undermine their leftmost flank as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. The joke I've been telling, half joke, I suppose, mostly privately, but semi-publicly too, when I speak to audiences, is I think there's a lot. I'm optimistic in a way, as I know you are on this issue. Maybe not for all the same reasons, but I think parallel reasons. Because when you tell normal Americans what the leading edge of the left really wants, what regime they want, and what they're doing to bring it about, they think you're making it up. They don't think it can really be true.
Yeah.
And that's a great reason for hope for me, because I think a lot of just normal Americans who want to raise their kids, make a decent living, be good to their neighbors, and be comfortable and secure in their financial prosperity, and take care of their loved ones and all that. Just normal people living normal lives. They're just starting to glimpse what the left's plan is. And in a way, that's remarkable because, as you document in the book, the left has been at it for a long time. I mean, it really started spilling out of the campuses in a major way in the 90s, and the infrastructure had been laid decades before that. But I mean, what do you make of that? How is the Great Awakening about the Great Awokening going as you tour across the country?
Yeah, that dynamic is certainly at play, and I think how I see it is really this interesting dialectic or debate or conflict that I had with left-wing media while I was doing all of this critical race theory reporting. The line of attack against me, which was somewhat implicitly flattering, was that I was a master propagandist that was inventing critical race theory out of whole cloth, and then manipulating the public through my Fox News whispering to rise up and revolt in thousands of school boards across the country to fight something that didn't exist. I mean, it was if only I had that level of kind of hypnotic power, that would be great. But of course, what they always left out of the stories every single time was the actual substance of the reporting that I was doing. I was showing with original source documents exactly what they were teaching in schools, exactly how they were training employees in the federal government, exactly what kind of DEI programs and corporations, the ideology that they were pushing. And so in every case, and I always posted the original source documents, I posted thousands and thousands of pages of material to say, this is happening, this is real, this is widespread, here's the evidence. And they always dodged it. And I think that it's for precisely the reason that you say is they had to ignore it. They had to pretend it didn't exist because it was so embarrassing that even the furthest ideologues on the New York Times op-ed page couldn't in good conscience, or really couldn't even in good taste defend the substance of what their allies and colleagues were doing.
Yeah. Without revealing too much of your insider Svengali communications playbook, for the young activists out there, and reporters and others, I know you've talked a little bit about this before in different venues, but can you just help them understand how best to go about navigating this hostile media environment and getting your message across?
Yeah, there are really two key points that I think are most important, although there's a whole broad range of ideas. But the first thing is to find that shocking, salacious, red hot detail. And so as you're doing reporting, I find that a lot of folks approach it kind of like a term paper. It's dry, it's factual, but there might be a hot detail that is somewhere in the documentation, somewhere in the story that has to move up. You can't bury the lead. And for better or for worse, the media moves on shocking new information. And so the more heat that you can find, I always kind of tell folks that work with me, what's the hot thing? What is that oh my gosh, your eyebrows raise when you see it? That's the kind of detail you need. And those things have intrinsic power. They travel through the media ecosystem. They shape narratives. They get you on, television. They really make whatever you're doing fly. And the second thing is get ready to kind of fight with your adversaries. And actually, the worst thing that can happen to you is that nobody is attacking you. Nobody is attacking you because they don't feel that what you're doing is a threat to their power or influence or narrative. And actually, when people start attacking you, it's I mean, sometimes it's bad, right? If you do something bad and you get embarrassed, it's not always good to be attacked. If you piss your pants and people are laughing at you, well, you pissed your pants, so not great. But in general, you want to actually even try to set the frame and bait your opponents into attacking you in a way that you already know your response, where you can kind of shift it back in your favor. And so the techniques of actual debate are not, the Lincoln Douglas debate, as much as I wish that they were. It's something quite different. It's more like the yellow journalism, or those pamphlets from the founding even. I mean, they were brutal in how they attacked each other.
Yeah.
And that is still the discourse, kind of the basics of it. And so you got to buckle up and get ready for it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sort of a tired example, of course, but the Jefferson Adams fight was so much fun. Adams was a monarchist who wanted to overthrow the Constitution, and Jefferson was going to legalize incest and all sorts of crazy stuff. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
But I should say, state for the record, of course, that you don't walk that line. You are not a propagandist. There's always quite a bit of substance behind it, but you are very talented at getting that juicy nugget and baiting your opponents into advancing.
And I think that the other thing too is that I don't do, and I actually think that I would recommend for folks that are younger and thinking about what they're doing to consider at least this point is, I don't do partisan horse race politics.
Yeah.
I don't do boosting campaigns or attacking other campaigns. I mean, I really try to stay laser focused. I don't comment on general items. I very rarely, I try to maintain a lot of discipline, not commenting on items that are outside of my domain, because ultimately you can only really alienate. And if it's not your core interest or your core set of kind of subject matter, you're better off like leaving it to others and holding your opinion, a little close to the chest. And I think that if you enter the kind of partisan, candidate stuff, I just think that it takes away from and can degrade the more substantive policy work. And so I think that, especially for young reporters, young writers, it's like there are so many general commentators. It's such a crowded field. I think there's a lot of talk, but very little insight. Mm-hmm. Focus on some niche, laser focus on it in a way where you can actually move the needle. And that's the better way to kind of build a body of work, to build a reputation, to build some influence, than trying to comment in a general way on everything.
Yeah. Have any books been useful to you over the years on this topic, the sort of comms political game? And if the answer is no, that's fine. I'm just curious.
No, there have been, but sadly the answer is all very left-wing books. And so, I mean, really, truly, I mean, without revealing too much, I would say that you have to read your Alinsky. Yeah. You have to read your Gramsci. You even, of course, with many caveats, should probably read your Lenin. And so look, the left has done successful narrative warfare for a long time, and we can bracket it to the 20th century, or you could really bracket it to the 18th, or rather the 19th and even the 18th century. Mm-hmm. Left-wing ideas that are, I think, kind of misguided in their conception and then disastrous in their consequences, have still managed to kind of shape the public mind and gather public attention. And for those of us on the right that want to fight against them, I think it's essential to know why they're attractive, how they travel, how they accumulate power, and how the best practitioners on the other side have managed to make them so influential. And so for me, it's I kind of sometimes you have to hold your nose and read the the literature of your opponents in order to actually improve your own practice.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, if you look at the success of the left over the last century, and especially in the face of the collapse of the Soviet Union, I mean, its main political avatar and ideological avatar, really was defeated in many ways, and yet it still has been remarkably effective, and maybe even most effective in spreading across the institutions of higher education and government in America after the fall of the Soviet Union. It's kind of a remarkable thing. So not to study those tactics would be silly. Our friend, I don't know if you know Kyle Scheidler, but he works for the Center for Security Policy, and he's reading a lot about Mao's Cultural Revolution, of course, because if we're in a cultural revolution here in the United States, we ought to learn about the original one, where the improbable thing of a peasant revolt leading to the overthrow of one of the oldest civilizations in the world and its ideological transformation. Yeah, you got to learn from your enemies.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, agree. I love Kyle, and I think that he's spot on in a lot of these things. And look, I think also the right in general is getting more sophisticated and more successful along these lines. There are so many people doing great work, and in particular, I think a big game changer that we should discuss, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, is post Elon Twitter, which is still, I think, the most valuable means of political communication in the United States. And if you can get a story to blow up on Twitter, that story gets coverage everywhere. And they may not be tweeting, but certainly every news editor in the country, both left and right, is at least lurking, and that's such an important source of information. And I'd be curious how you think about it and where you think that's going.
Yeah, I think Twitter, now X, is a work in progress. And I don't mean that as a slight on Elon at all. I mean, for those paying attention, he took it over, he shook things up. The regime is going after him. I mean, he's facing multiple, or at least one federal lawsuit or aggression against him. So I think the regime, that term's thrown about maybe too loosely, but I think it's apt in a way. Our current regime is going after Elon and X, and that's proof, I think, of its value in a way. As you said, I mean, not that many Americans are on Twitter, all told. A lot more on Facebook, of course, but all of political journalism lives on Twitter. So it really is you can manipulate the hive mind of center left and left wing journalism pretty effectively through Twitter. So it's just a very valuable platform, and I'm happy to see that Elon took a real risk and put some real skin in the game and taking it over. And I think his motives, nobody's motives are pristine or totally pure, but I think he did it for the right reasons, which he's a sort of old school liberal of a stripe and believes in free speech. And if he didn't do it, somebody worse would. So kudos to him for that.
No, I think it's good. Elon's politics are so funny because his mind is almost like a subreddit. He has kind of Reddit style insights into politics, and it's a bit incoherent. It's a bit shallow. But given that, I think directionally he's absolutely right. And he's a businessman. He's an entrepreneur. He's an inventor. He's not he's not Leo Strauss. That's not his role. That's not his job. And so I think that his work so far has been good. I think the platform is better, and I know that I felt towards the end of the old Twitter that my days were numbered on the platform. That I was very careful. I was trying to be very mindful of the taboos, but the taboos were getting stronger and stronger. And now it feels as if there is much more range of discourse. As long as you're not sending someone death threats, which of course should be restricted. And I think that the politics shifts on this. And I think that specifically on trans, we've seen the politics shift partly because of the opening. I mean, you could not call a man under the old Twitter rules. I mean, you had to lie. You had to lie to pass muster. And I think that we're seeing a kind of simultaneous backlashes that are perhaps even gaining territory. First, the CRT backlash against the Black Lives Matter riots. Second, what I think is the kind of freedom of speech backlash against social media policies. And then we also have the school choice backlash against the schools doing ideology and COVID restrictions. And the right is not purely reactionary, but at the same time, practical politics suggests that if there is a backlash, you should ride it and you should shape it and you should guide it towards actual policy outcomes. And look, the right has been chasing school choice, for example, for 60 years with no success. And then all of a sudden, after CRT, after gender, after COVID, we have now 7 states with universal school choice scholarship programs. These are real, meaningful changes, and I think that we have to be, always mindful of where we can find other opportunities.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, Elon deserves a lot of credit, even if he did nothing else in taking over Twitter, exposing the kind of shocking level of hand in glove cooperation between the intelligence community and the deep state and social media platforms. In a way that they can never go back to that old world, and that's a good thing. And just the irony of our preachy government in its opposition to Trump carping all the time about Russian disinformation and misinformation when, you know, uh, it wasn't quite Soviet-esque or even Putin-esque Russia style. But our intelligence community had its fingers sunk very deep into the manipulation of what people were reading and learning about online, whether it be COVID or trans stuff, all the things you mentioned, let
And,
alone
and
the conduct of our elections and how we talk about and deliberate about politics.
and we're supposed to believe that the McCarthy to Hoover era, J. Edgar Hoover era was everyone was under surveillance. It was deeply repressive on freedom of speech and discourse, and obviously like bracketing the times where the FBI clearly went beyond the law, against the law, beyond the bounds of the Constitution. Condemning that and bracketing it for now. But if you look at just the surveillance question, you know, I saw some great recent stories that explain that there were something like fewer than 100 wiretaps at any one time by the FBI in the late 1960s, because the effort to wiretap somebody was such an enormous technological and administrative production. They could only run a few dozen at a time, maybe 6, 7 dozen at a time. Whereas now, essentially everyone is wiretapped. I
Yeah.
mean, the government has access to an unbelievable amount of communications. The surveillance and the raw data that it sucks up every day is many, many orders of magnitude greater than anything that they had done under Hoover. And so for those leftists who say that, the surveillance under Hoover was, the greatest threat to our liberties imaginable. I mean, look, there's an argument for that. I get it. But you should say, okay, and therefore this is at now, 1,000x, 10,000x, maybe, 100,000x scale. Well,
Hmm.
why isn't this all of a sudden a great threat to liberty? You know,
Right.
and the answer is, well, because the FBI and the other intelligence services are enforcing that left wing narrative. So there's this kind of willful blindness to anything like that.
Yeah, it's funny. I think as you do too, extended family that I married into who don't share my political views. And one of them was saying a few months ago, they're sort of uneasy, right, to be defending the FBI and the CIA these days, considering their positions on those organizations as short as short a time ago as even the George W. Bush administration,
And
let
they're also
alone the
defending
'60s.
the kind of the war effort. I mean, the
Right.
global war.
Yeah.
It's such an odd it's such an odd switch. It's such an odd inversion. And I think that it's very simple though at the same time. It's
Hmm.
people are more amenable to power that is working in their favor than they are to power that is working,
Of course.
against their interests or against their beliefs. I think it's a pretty natural human reaction.
Yeah, no, that's right. We didn't need to go to Carl Schmitt to learn about friend-enemy distinction in politics.
Yeah.
It's there in Aristotle, Machiavelli, all the way through. Any rational observer of how politics works. Yeah,
Yeah. Pretty it's not I mean, it's not a brilliant insight in itself,
right,
right? I mean,
right.
it's pretty obvious. Yeah.
Yeah, the Federalist Papers talked about, they didn't quite put it this way, but the unholy union of self-love and self-interest. That's what we're seeing in a lot of these
That's right.
instances. And my colleague Theo Wold, who is now the Solicitor General of Idaho, comes to our summer fellowships and talks a bit to the Lincoln, Publius, and even John Marshall Fellows. And his argument is we should just remind ourselves that this was really started, at least the current surveillance state, started by a Republican administration in response to 9/11.
100%.
Yeah, the
100%.
intelligence community and the deep state is really born. Some of the tools are already there, but it's really born after 9/11. And so we ought to be clear-eyed about that. I know you and I like to beat up on libertarians on education policy and other stuff, but they were dead right about the problem
They
of
were right.
that giant security bureaucracy that was created. Yeah.
they were absolutely right in that sense, and they were right about the war too in a lot of ways. I mean, their very lonely voices were in opposition to any of the wars in the early 2000s, at least on the right. And at the time, I was on the left, so I opposed the war, and I think quite rightly. Um, but I think that there is a healthy debate within the right now. If you look at even on the Ukraine matter,
Hmm.
and again, it's a bit outside of my expertise, but from a very basic point of view, I think it's healthy to have competing opinions. So if everyone is fervently pointing in one direction on such a serious matter, I think it's important to have someone, at least someone, to say, "Hey, let's think this through. Let's consider the opposite point of view."
Yeah. I want to go back to the 70s for a moment. I know you had a City Journal piece about this, laying out this argument that we've actually, it's close to Claremont's heart. Our senior fellow John Marini has been arguing about this for years, which is that Nixon really was taken out by the deep state at root because of his plans to dismantle the bureaucracy and bring it into line and put it back under presidential control. I just want to praise you for your courage for raising that. There's a kind of a revisionist Nixon Renaissance going on, so you were drafting on that a little bit, but so that's the political solution, right? Is Nixon, in many ways, Nixon's blueprint, although without his paranoia and fumbles.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I certainly have talked with John Marini about it and
Yeah.
admire him. I mean, I just admire John's thinking, throughout his whole body of work. But I went a little bit, further even. I mean,
Hmm.
of course, yes, if you look at the Nixon kind of Watergate takedown, and you read some of the more recent books with declassified documents, it appears it looks worse and worse. I mean, it looks more and more like a kind of a deep state operation that capitalized on Nixon's own mistakes, own
Yeah.
paranoia. But the genesis of it, and people don't even know this. He didn't commission the Watergate burglars. It was all something that a problem that rose up to him after the fact, and then the people who commissioned or actually orchestrated it were longtime CIA hands.
Yeah.
That is, documented over and over. They brought in some, kind of CIA stooges from Q. I mean, Q. It's a really an amazing story when you dig into it. It's not the Woodward Bernstein,
Yeah.
very very cut and dried narrative that was fed to the Washington Post at the time. But my argument was a bit broader. My argument was that um, let's accept, kind of the premise of my argument was that we need to accept that politics froze in 1968, and we haven't been able to get out of this 1968 loop. And the emergence in 2020 of the left-wing radical movements is a simple rebirth of the left-wing radical movements of that earlier era. The left has had no new policies, no new vocabulary, no new anything in this entire time. And the right has not figured out how to emerge from this loop, how to break this loop, how to get out of this loop. And so my idea was, well, let's go back to the genesis of this kind of political conflict and see what lessons we can learn from the origin point, and in particular, what lessons we can learn from Richard Nixon, who I actually think, having studied what he was doing and studied his speeches and diaries and policies proposals, he really saw things with remarkable clarity and remarkable foresight, and many of the insights that he had that were then papered over because of the reputational damage that he withstood are still worth dusting off and still worth considering, and they actually can still yield insights for us. And so, might these, and I thought I would be attacked for it. It kind of, people kind of didn't care too much. I think the Nixon, hatred is changing, it's lessening, it's dissipating.
Yeah.
Um, but I actually think that we have a lot to learn from him. And of course, I'm very sympathetic as a California, as a California born and raised. And so you can kind of feel that in Nixon as well. And
Yeah.
isn't it so strange? I mean, you're in, California now, and at the center of this kind of geography is, you had Nixon and Reagan,
Mhm.
from California. You had great kind of Western conservative leaders. And it's so interesting to think back about how that was possible and what it meant.
Yeah, it's one of the great tragedies of the post-war era is, and it's illustrative of and intertwined with this problem of bureaucracy, the ruining of California by the left. I mean, they transformed a middle class paradise, the likes of which the world had never seen, human civilization had never seen, and in the span of a few decades, have really ruined it. I mean, the weather's still good. California's a great place to live if you're wealthy, retired, and you bought a house a long time ago, or very poor. It's the if you're middle class, and that you see that in the people moving with their feet or voting with their feet. California lost some congressional seats last census, and they're going to lose more next census. It's a remarkable turn for a state that had grown every year since its founding until like 10 years ago. And
Wow.
that's even
Yeah.
with
I
the
mean,
surge of immigration, which is, it's crazy.
yeah, that's a key point because they backfilled the actual true loss through
Right.
through all the forms of immigration. But um, it's sad. I think having grown up there, my parents moved to California when they were starting to build their lives, and they describe how it was at that time. I could see it in my grandparents who moved to California, many, many decades ago, and the life that they had down in Southern California and the Coachella Valley, and then I lived all over the state, for many years in Sacramento and the Bay Area, down in LA, and it's just tragic. It's devastating, and I find it just still to this day so dispiriting that the people of California can see the kind of decomposition of their society around them, to see the very visual and very violent images that are constantly flickering across their screens and also their eyes in daily life, and not put the dots together to the extent that they can actually make sound political judgments. It just feels like the scale of the problem is so large that there's no one that can summon the courage and the resources that it would take to challenge what's happening.
Yeah.
And I think that's why so many people just say, I'm going to go ahead and save the money and not pay the 14% state income tax and just
Right.
move elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. It really is a shame. My joke now is in March, my wife and I are moving to Texas. We're sort of expanding the Claremont Institute to Dallas. And we'll still have an office here in California. And of course, our longtime major donor base is here and will be here. And we'll have fellowships here, galas here, and all the rest. But my joke now is, we just have to live somewhere more sane. And it's all right. We can still visit California. We'll just visit like a foreign country with nice beaches and mountains and all the rest. I don't mean to
Yeah.
say we should give up on California, but I think for the foreseeable future, it's going to be a tough slog for the forces of sanity. I think it'll have to get, unfortunately, worse, a lot worse before it gets better. I wanted to ask you about, well, I'll follow up on that theme with your decision to stay in a blue state, Chris. I know you've sort of, in some ways, very intelligently, of course, moved out of Seattle, but you're still in Washington State. What's your advice to folks? Maybe California is too extreme of an example, but do you think that one needs to move to a red state? Obviously, by your actions so far, not so much, huh?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's so many factors to consider, right?
Yeah,
It's a very personal decision,
of course.
and so I can speak to myself, first and foremost. I mean, moving from California to Washington State was already a big improvement.
Yeah.
The reason why I think Washington State has while of course Seattle is very left wing, has not had the same kind of scale of problems as California is twofold. One is that there's a constitutional provision against a graduated state income tax,
Mhm.
which means that there's effectively no state. I mean, there's no state income tax in Washington State,
Yeah.
and so I think that restrains the ability of the state government to get too far out of pocket. Just because there's a budget cap, whereas in California it goes up now to I think 15, 16%, something just extreme and insane, frankly. The second thing is it's just a small state. It's 7 million odd inhabitants. So there's this scale question where it's much easier to govern, and I think it still has a bit of the pioneer spirit, being one of the last areas to get settled. There's a kind of libertarian spirit. There's a more pioneer spirit. There are some cultural as well as political and economic restraints on bad governance. And then personally, I moved to a small town, and then actually recently, my wife and I will be moving again across town to a small farm property,
Oh, nice.
and so we'll have some space and some land and some some kind of a small farm, and so I think that even within blue states, there are good areas and good communities. And so what I found to be the right solution is to, make sure that the politics at the state level are not too, oppressive or too tyrannical. Finding a nice kind of community where that has a lot of people that share your values, and
Mhm.
then finding actual institutions where you live your daily life, your kids' school, your church, your workplace, and making sure that those are all very much aligned with whatever values that in this case the values that I have and my family has. And so we've been able to put that together in a way that makes a lot of sense, in a way that has been just great. And I think that you'd find that even in California and some of the kind of more inland communities or more kind of exurban or rural communities, or even in Southern California, like if you live in parts of Orange County that are very right
Right.
wing and very excitable, you know, I think that is a good solution for people who live in blue states and don't want to necessarily move to Texas or Florida.
Yeah, yeah. Huntington Beach was ground zero for COVID resistance here in Southern California, for just one of many examples. And if you go up to the Sierra foothills and the Gold Country, I remember we have
Yes.
a couple of friends from grad school live up there, and they reported that BLM, some high school students and maybe some outside agitators tried to do a BLM parade or protest one day, and they got I mean, I'm not condoning threats of violence or anything, but they got so many threats from locals and or bikers that they just shut the whole thing down.
We
It's
had the same thing in our little town here in Washington, and
yeah.
I'll tell you a funny story. And without naming names, so there was going to be a big BLM thing, and so a lot of the folks from town, they went. They were strapped. They had they had their ARs at the safety on, trigger off the finger, pointed down. But they were monitoring the situation. And it turned out to be really just a couple high school kids that were very peaceful and actually very cool. I drove by and talked to them, and there was our state senator was there on the other corner with the opposing sign, and it was kind of a wholesome protest moment, totally fine. But then there was supposed to be this Antifa. Antifa is coming to Gig Harbor, Washington, which I always thought, I think that this is probably more of a rumor than a reality. But
Yeah.
you know, I'll tell you what, you had guys in town that were prepared for any outcome. Guys that were very sophisticated, guys that were doing, kind of the infrared from the tops of buildings. They were taking distances with the laser, the lasers or whatever. America outside of the very dense urban areas, Americans are very capable of defending their own interests. And I think that that's something that you saw in blips and pieces during George Floyd, where people, neighbors got together and said, hey, there's 10, 12 of us, we're good. If anything goes sideways, let's all get together. And so I think that most of our country is still well functioning, still very healthy, still very public spirited, still very, kind of attuned to the basic desires of most people. And so, these are all fun anecdotes. Well, of course, everyone has to do it in a responsible manner. But I think that there is a side of America that is, let's say, unwilling to just submit to, to violence, to destruction, to chaos.
Yeah. Let's I mean, your book's about the American Cultural Revolution, and let's finish by talking a bit about culture. I want to get your take on what, right-wing donors should be doing that they're not. And culture, of course, is important. It's something that the right's been very bad at. We tend to be all right, I suppose, especially under the guidance and influence of effective communicators like yourself with politics. especially at the national level and communication, not always, but often. But we neglect this very important piece of American life that's very influential. You know, having cool scenes and supporting art and film and all that. What would your advice be to big Republican donors who maybe are open to the argument? I know Peter Thiel's been dabbling in some of this stuff, but what kind of stuff should they be funding on the cultural front, do you think?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think that it's the time is what donors should be doing, in my view, is placing a large number of small bets that in as a whole creates a cultural ecosystem with many different players, many different voices, many different small projects. What they should not do is invest $50 million in a badly scripted, kind of poorly directed, Ayn Rand, fiction movie. I mean, you might as well light $50 million on fire. I think the idea that you can create a big budget right wing blockbuster is probably not the best use of donor money, but you could, send a bunch of people in their 20s $10,000 to do cool projects and then host some, kind of cool events in New York and LA and San Francisco. Give it a bit of dissident energy. I think those are good bets. Obviously do it at arm's length through various enterprises in case some of those projects get need to be cut loose. Given the variable nature of quality
Mm-hmm.
and just the variable nature of artists. I think also what's really important is to create institutions of culture, particularly around education, where there are many, many opportunities right now. I know for a fact, at my own experience, but also in the reporting and in the statistics, that conservative parents in particular are looking for alternatives in education, and a school is a great place to build alternative centers of power and influence, a great place to protect people's values, a great place to start reclaiming cultural territory. And so big investments in education, big investments broadly dispersed in arts and culture. And then I think that another thing that could be quite useful, and Claremont is certainly doing this with some of the digital summits, is creating more avenues for people to get together and to have camaraderie and to have
Yeah.
fellowship and to have friendships, and some of those experiences where donors might say, well, what's the ROI? What's the tangible outcome? Of course they're entitled to demanding an answer to those questions, but I think we have to explain to folks that that these intangibles, obviously you don't want to blow out the budget, but some of these kind of events have huge return
Mm-hmm.
in an intangible sense, and create some of that serendipity that leads to good outcomes.
Yeah. 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 CPAC Japan or CPAC Brazil might just be a grift, but conferences are they're poo-pooed, but I think you're right. They're conferences and stuff like that, getting people together. I think there's an old, I don't know if it's a Buckley line, I'm not sure, but it's, never underestimate what good you can bring about by getting a bunch of like-minded folks who are public spirited in the same room over good food and good drink. And you never know what those network connections will result in, and you just got to keep plugging away at it. And yeah, I think the donor class on the right, unlike the left, now granted the left has more money both in foundations and NGOs, et cetera, I understand, but being a little less interested in the instant return on investment. I mean, the left makes all these bets. They'll give some kid, like you said, $7,000, $15,000 to do some quirky art project. 9 out of 10 go nowhere, but it fuels this ecosystem that is a vehicle for changing culture. And there's no substitute for the hard work and the blocking and tackling, which on our donor side means putting some money towards this stuff.
That's
And
right. And I
yeah.
would tell donors too, the right has always thrived, and I think there's still enormous opportunity in low cost means of communication.
Mhm.
The right was big on, newsletters. The right was big on talk radio.
Yeah.
And the right is now big on social media, podcasts, video production. and so I think that there are low cost means of communication. People can build audiences, people can build influence, people can launch new, small magazines. All of these efforts, start to attract people. They start to build into something greater. And I would love if we would have someone on the right with a kind of clear and serene sense of the entire playing field, and how all of these small institutions fit together, and then figuring out how to actually turn their efforts collectively into something powerful.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to stop. I want to thank you for all your work, Chris. I know, people from the outside look at the kind of things you do and they think it's easy, but those of us who are engaged in this sort of work, that is communications, journalism, scholarship, and all that, know that you're one of the hardest workers in America. So in this space, so we're grateful, and I think the country's been improved by all your work. And where can people should go buy your new book? It's already a bestseller, but where else should they go to get all your stuff?
Amazon, of course, for the book, America's Cultural Revolution. And then my Substack is now at christopherrufo.com. I post everything that I do there, and I have a great comments section as well. And, I appreciate it. And yeah, I work hard, but I also, it's fun. And I think that, that's also a very Claremont spirit as well. As we actually love politics, which is not as common as you might think.
Yeah.
And so I just think that is the more that we can be joyful warriors, the more that we can have fun in what we're doing, the more that we can, not take ourselves too seriously, the more success we'll find.
Yeah. Amen. All right. Well, thank you, Chris. This has been great.
All right. Thanks. And we'll see y'all soon.
Thank you all for listening to this special episode, and we'll be back to our normal weekly roundtable podcast next week. As always, if you'd like to learn more about what the Claremont Institute does, visit our website at claremont.org. If you'd like to support our work, go to claremont.org/donate. You can find our print publication, our flagship publication, at claremontreviewbooks.com. All of our work in Washington, D.C. and around the states, advising policymakers on threats to the American way of life and what to do about them, at dc.claremont.org. And of course, the American Mind website, which offers us more of a daily take on the news and the intersection of ideas and politics. That's at americanmind.org. Thank you all for listening.